So is it a case of Vladimir Putin putting Joe Biden to the test over Ukraine, with 2 U.S. warships headed to the Black Sea in response to a Russian troop buildup at the border, Moscow announcing live fire drills in the same waters, while Ukraine trumpets land maneuvers for its military? We're going to be asking about a neighborhood that's getting awfully crowded and the timing of the sudden spike in tension less than 3 months into that Biden presidency. On that score, we'll also ask about the U.S. leader's Tuesday telephone call with Vladimir Putin, only the second since Inauguration Day in the U.S., and that offer of a summit at a neutral venue. The suggestion followed up with the U.S. ambassador invited to talks at the Kremlin this Wednesday. So is this just a simple testing of wills, or is it much more? As a priority, Ukraine waxes and wanes on Moscow's radar. Many ordinary Russians say they feel an ownership over the whole of Ukraine, not just the 2 Donbas provinces where the Kremlin is backing a low-level insurgency. But again, it's the question of why now and whether Putin really is picking a fight. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the showdown in the Black Sea. With us, he was recently an election observer in the Ukrainian province of Luhansk, which is in the Donbas, journalist Julian Mundy. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
I want to welcome as well Lyudmila Tatyeva, member of Ukraine Action advocacy group based here in Paris.
Good morning. Oh, good evening, sorry.
Oh, it's good morning somewhere.
Good morning somewhere.
Thank you for being with us. From Moscow, international affairs commentator Mark Sloboda. How are you?
Hi, I'm alive. How are you?
Okay, still alive as well. And from Syracuse, New York, Brian Taylor, professor of political science at Syracuse University, author of The Code of Putinism, your piece out this week in Foreign Affairs entitled Putin's Rules of the Game. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 41,000 Russian troops across the border from Ukraine, another 42,000 in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. And now the announcement of those naval exercises in the Black Sea. That's in response to 2 destroyers, the USS Donald Cook and the USS Roosevelt, passing through the Bosphorus, notifying the Turks that they're going en route to the area. Julian Mundy, what's it all about?
Well, I wish I knew. I think we won't know until it's all over. I hope that it's just Putin putting Biden to the test. But it's always very dangerous when you put in men and hardware in any situation, and this is particularly volatile. If the Ukrainians are now starting exercises on their side, it won't take much for there to be a mistake or a provocation that could set things off. I think something that has been not mentioned very much that is important is the role of Turkey. Turkey is on the other side of the Black Sea. Turkey is not happy about the annexation of Crimea. It's never backed it, never supported it. And we've seen Turkey in action in Azerbaijan recently, well, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and we've seen it in Libya. And I think that Turkey is the country we need to watch.
How so? I mean, they're not going to take on Russia, are they?
Who knows? They have sort of quite sophisticated. They have a sophisticated drone system. They've been selling drones to Ukraine. President Zelensky was in Istanbul last weekend talking to Erdogan, and they signed various agreements on defense cooperation. I think that's the area we should be watching very, very carefully.
All right. So another player to look out for, Lyudmila Tatyeva. What do you make of the Russian troop buildup, the U.S. sending the warships, the Russians increasing their naval exercises?
I would say that I agree on partly what Julian was saying about Russia putting to the test Biden. But it's also not only about that. It's about the internal situation, domestic politics in Russia, and Putin being not so, let's say, high on polls. And frequently, very frequently in Russia, what has been done to, let's say, turn away the attention of the population from their internal problems, especially if we talk about Navalny imprisonment and his worsening situation with his health, it's of course doing something outside and mobilizing itself against enemies. And of course the enemy at the occurrence is Ukraine, and now it's for another, 7 years now that the war is going. And of course, U.S., because automatically Russia does not see Ukraine as an autonomous sovereign state that can make a decision on its own to move its own direction, but it sees Ukraine only through the prism of geopolitics and, the play with U.S.
Let's take the precept that it is domestic politics that may be driving Vladimir Putin's calculations. He's still popular. There's no question that he's the one who's going to win elections that are scheduled for next September.
Yes, but nobody wants additional problems, additional, manifestations or any other upheavals of population in Russia. So we have seen that has been more frequent than in other years. It depends on what's going to happen, but I guess a quick win, a good win, and a comeback on a global stage in general, that would help him to get through with a, more supportive electorate.
Mark Sloboda, we saw back in 2014, Putin's popularity rose to 80% after the annexation of Crimea. Do you agree with Ludmila?
Yeah, no, I think that the idea that this is some kind of test of Biden, I mean, with due respect, that's kind of poli-science 101 level analysis. It's kind of a hubris. It has the assumption that other countries don't have their own foreign and military priorities, national interests, as if Russia doesn't have interests in Ukraine, and that they're just waiting to test the new U.S. president, when it's perfectly obvious one that U.S. policy, has limited control by any given president in the White House, rarely, changes from whatever occupant to the next occupant. So I don't buy that this is testing Biden. This isn't about domestic politics in Russia. Putin's approval rating has been very solid. There isn't an appetite for foreign adventures in the country right now. It wouldn't necessarily hurt his approval rolls, but it certainly wouldn't help them either.
So
what is going on? This is about domestic politics of the Kiev regime in Ukraine. Zelensky's approval rating is some 30%, and his party, Servant of the People, named after his comedic TV show, is even lower than that. This is about the Kiev regime amassing military forces, almost unreported by the Western media, for the last I was reporting on it from the beginning of March, moving tanks, artillery pieces, thousands of Ukrainian conscripts from all over the country, and even ballistic missiles east to the contact line with Donbass. And Russia's military buildup, rather modest by any stretch. Any military analyst worth their salt will tell you 40,000 troops. Yes, absolutely. How much do large military drills by NATO and the U.S., you see them with 30, 40,000 people. When military analysts talk about what would be necessary to invade Iraq or Iran, by the United States, they're talking upwards of 150, 200,000 troops. Be serious here. And you don't have to take my word for it. The Pentagon, reporting to CNN, says they do not see these troops in an offensive posture. If you listen to experts from the American Center, CNAS, the Center for New American Security, some of the top U.S. military experts, no friends to Vladimir Putin, Michael Kaufman, Maxim Samarukov, they say that this is a defensive buildup and a deterrent.
A defensive buildup. It's enough, certainly, to worry Germany's defense minister. She spoke to state broadcaster ARD. Let's take a listen.
Mein Eindruck ist, dass die russische Seite eben alles versucht, Reaktionen zu provozieren. Und wir wollen uns gemeinsam mit der Ukraine auf dieses Spiel nicht einlassen.
So there you hear Brian Taylor saying that it is a provocation and that the West shouldn't rise to the bait. Your thoughts on what's happening?
Sure. Well, I think the use of the word provocation here is interesting because we've heard that word out of Washington And we've heard that word out of Moscow, and now we're hearing it out of Berlin. It's all sides are expecting some kind of escalation or worrying about some kind of escalation. I don't agree with Mark Sloboda that this is some kind of defensive deterrent move, but I would say that I don't think there is a plan right now in Moscow for war. It's more preparations. And I do agree with him in one respect. I think he channeled quite well the thinking of certain forces in the Kremlin that believe that Zelensky is someone who might behave in an unpredictable way. I think in Moscow they were quite upset by Zelensky's moves against the pro-Russian oligarch inside Ukraine, Medvedchuk, who is quite close to Putin and whose television stations were taken off the air. So I think from the point of view of the Kremlin, they see moves like that as being approved in advance with Washington. I don't think that happened, but I think that's how they read it in Moscow. So in that sense, I think there's worrisome attitudes about this on both sides. I think it's important to stress a point that was made earlier, that Russia invaded Ukraine 7 years ago. So to talk about Russia invading Ukraine now, it's more a continuation of steps that were taken with the annexation of Crimea and the sponsoring of insurgents inside the Donbass. I don't expect Moscow to escalate at the moment, but we should just be clear about how this whole conflict started in the first place.
Brian, you mentioned there Viktor Medvedchuk, and it's kind of a reminder that before 2014, Ukraine had a pro-Moscow president. Medvedchuk, he's being probed over a stake he recently acquired in a Russian oil refinery for a mere $40,000. Why does he matter so much?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that Putin's goal all along was not to control Crimea or to control a tiny section of southeast Ukraine in the Donbass. The goal before 2014 was to bring all of Ukraine into the Russian political and economic orbit. And those plans went awry with the Euromaidan revolution that took place in Ukraine in 2014. And since that time, Donbass has been used to a certain extent as a lever to try and influence internal Ukrainian politics. The problem for the Kremlin is that the very act of annexing Crimea and sponsoring a war in the Donbass has turned the Ukrainian population in a much more pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-Western direction. So despite the long-term Russian goal of keeping Ukraine within its sphere of influence, they've actually harmed themselves by the responses they've taken to developments in Ukraine since 2014, and especially, as I noted, the annexation and the sponsoring of a war in the Donbass.
Julian Nundy, when you went to the Donbass last October, what was the sentiment there?
Well, it was actually a fairly quiet period. There's very, very heavy security for obvious reasons all along the Ukrainian-controlled part of Luhansk. There was no particular apprehension at the time about the war cranking up, but it's always there. You can occasionally. The year before, I was also in Severodonetsk, which is the de facto capital of Luhansk nowadays. I was there for 3 months, and then at night we could hear artillery in the distance. People are nervous, people are tired, but there was at that time no particular anxiety. The anxiety seems to be coming along now.
And there are people on both sides of the divide, right, in Luhansk?
Yeah,
Yes.
there are people on both sides who are living, like, let's say, on the Russian troops-controlled side, and then on the Ukrainian side. And then, of course, I guess...
And it's a part of Ukraine where everyone speaks Russian. They don't speak Ukrainian.
Both.
They speak both, and I come originally from Lugansk, so I can tell, also from my own experience, people do speak Ukrainian as well, but they speak, let's say, in the mix of Russian and Ukrainian that is called surzik, which is something that is very common, especially elderly population. But just coming back to this issue of a provocation, it's very interesting that provocation is used everywhere, but this is exactly what is Kremlin is saying, is basically trying to provoke Ukraine to do the defensive actions. And in this case, there's going to be escalation of conflict. And then Russia would come into Ukraine and say, we're going to protect our Russian citizens. Well, of course, because by this time now, the half of these people who are leaving the controlled Russian area have the Russian passports. So what an amazing pretext just to go and do what you want. And of course, Putin wants more. He wants access to Odessa. He wants access more to the sea, and he wants more. And that's something that is obvious. And this is not about the let's say sudden sentiment of Ukrainians and of Europeans who are like a little bit fussy about
is that what Putin wants? I'll put it to Brian Taylor. Or is that what Russians want? Historically, Russians, well, they don't really see Ukraine as anything other than part of their territory, part of their sphere, let's say.
Well, I think the issue of Russian feelings about Ukraine is actually quite complicated. Yes, I think most Russians tend to think of Ukrainians as being part of the one nationality, part of the same community. But if you look at polling specifically on the issue of Donbass, you can see that the population is quite split. It's about a quarter in 4 different categories. A quarter of Russians say they don't really know what to think about the future of the Donbass. About a quarter of them say it should be returned to Ukraine and become integrated into Ukraine in some way. About a quarter say it should be attached to Russia, should be merged with Russia, and about a quarter say it should be independent. So you have no consensus in the Russian population about what to do with respect to the Donbass situation. I would also add that we can see that there are a lot of domestic reasons that Russians are unhappy, having to do with declining living standards for the past 7 years. They've dropped about 10%. And just a feeling that the state is ineffective, unresponsive, and corrupt. And that's why you had about 100,000 people on the streets of over 150 cities and towns in Russia in January in response to the arrest of Alexei Navalny. So I think it would be highly risky for Vladimir Putin to think that he would be able to rally a lot of domestic support for launching another war right now. I don't believe that that is the play.
Alexei Navalny, whose name did not come up in that Tuesday telephone call between the U.S. and Russian leaders. We'll talk about it when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Troop buildups at the border between Russia and Ukraine, followed by naval exercises, military exercises on land as well. All sides on edge. It's been the topic at NATO headquarters. We're talking about it with journalist Julian Nundy, who was recently an election observer in the Donbass and the Ukrainian rebel province of Luhansk, where Ludmila Tatieva is from, a member of the Ukraine Action Advocacy Group. From Moscow, international affairs correspondent Mark Sloboda, and from Syracuse, New York, Professor Brian Taylor at Syracuse University, author of The Code of Putinism. After nearly 7 years, as we were saying just before the break, it's still going on, this tension, the killings as well. Both sides more battle-hardened in the Donbass than before. Our correspondent Gulliver Cragg filed this report.
7 years ago, volunteers rushed to help defend Ukraine. Some of them are still active on the front line and apprehensive.
Will there be an escalation? No one knows. Tensions rise, then it calms down, then again tenses up. We do have information, though, that the Russians are setting up field hospitals near the border with Ukraine, and that's a pretty serious sign.
Over the past couple of years, rising tensions have been accompanied by increased use of drones.
The other side are constantly flying drones and doing surveillance, though our teams deal with that quite well.
Oleg operates drones for the Ukrainian side. He takes us to see.
These things cost just over $1,000, but they get shot down a lot. We lose about one a month.
These commercially available drones can drop small explosives, but are mostly used for precision targeting and short-range surveillance. Oleg transfers all his footage to the army.
We're noticing a lot of movements of material at night. but mainly by the sound. They're not coming up close to the front line, so it's beyond my drone's range. Of course, maybe it's more about psychological pressure, all these movements.
If the inhabitants of Mariupol are feeling that psychological pressure, most don't want to show it.
Я думаю, никто на нас не нападет.
Это провокация, хочу вам сказать. Все будет хорошо.
Ukraine's leaders have also suggested Russia's troop movements may be a bluff. This local activist doubts that.
Can you imagine how much all this costs for Russia itself? A deployment on this scale is no simple matter.
Mariupol, the largest city in Donbass today controlled by Ukraine, is a strategic port. It was shelled in 2015, and according to what is for most people here the worst-case scenario, it could, again, be in Russia's sights.
Interesting in that report, Ludmila Tatieva, how we see that the locals themselves are, everyone's in the dark as to what's happening, really.
Yeah, well, while the locals are in the dark, let's say that the Ukrainian government has been calling the National Council on Security and Defense, let's say on separate occasions, several occasions, and a very short period of time to discuss what they would do, what to do in case the Russia starts to invade. And then just to mention that it's not there are all the arguments to believe that that could happen, because according to the intelligence service of Ukraine, by the end of April, around 100,000 soldiers would be at the border of Ukraine. And just the opposite of what has been said by our colleague from Moscow is actually the missile that is set in not far from the Ukrainian border in the Russian territory, and is 300 kilometers from Ukraine. So let's not revert the sides. It's actually very clear what has been happening, and also the NATO secretary has been confirming in his speech a few of those data points and the very worrisome things that are happening.
Mark Sloboda, investors are taking this seriously. We've seen the ruble fall the last couple of days on the fears that there are going to be fresh sanctions. How much of a pinch is that? And again, everybody's unclear as to whether a small spark can trigger something a lot worse.
Yeah, first of all, a reference to the beginning of this conflict. This conflict didn't begin with the so-called annexation of Crimea by Russia. This conflict began with the overthrow of the Ukrainian democratically elected government just over a month prior to that, openly backed by the West, violently and unconstitutionally. And then the people of Crimea, and full disclosure, my wife is Crimean, my in-laws live in Simferopol, and I have family all over East Ukraine, Donbass, Kharkov, Odessa. The government that they overwhelmingly elected to represent them was overthrown. They, with Russian assistance, had a referendum with overwhelming support, and no one questions that, to get out of Dodge. They didn't want to be part of that madhouse anymore. And that, of course, led to the Kiev regime assault on Donbass, ongoing with a frozen conflict to this day, to subjugate all of East Ukraine to the new regime, the seizure of power in Kiev. And there has been a continual reference of Russian-controlled and Russian-backed separatists. This is an attempt to deny the people of East Ukraine agency. They're not really people. They're pro-Russian something, right? Half of Ukraine is not rabidly anti-Russian. Which is, really what this is all about. They don't want to be part of a rabidly anti-Russian Ukraine. And this is about the manufacture of an anti-Russian Ukrainian nation by those political forces that seized power in Kiev in 2014. And they have staged a military buildup in an attempt, once again, to launch an attack on Donbass, to put that final conflict to an end, to cement their control over the tire of the country 7 years later. As to investors in Russia, the last round of U.S. sanctions was so ineffectual. They prevented the entry of a number of Russian officials who already can't travel to the West because of their security clearances, have no assets in the West because of Russian law, because they're high-ranking officials.
Right, but the ruble has fallen this week. I want to ask Julian.
Rises and drops. Sanctions. The West has very little economic leverage over Russia. That's the truth.
Let me just ask on this point, Julian Nundy. Your reaction on again, it's the question I was putting to you in part one of our discussion when you were in Luhansk, how people feel about this, how polarized they are is essentially what Mark Slobodka is talking about.
Well, when you're on the Ukrainian side, people tend to be very pro-Kiev. I was in Slavyansk in Donetsk Oblast a few years ago, and I was speaking to a retired police colonel, and I said, "What is the political makeup here?" And he said it's 50% pro-Kiev, 30% pro-Russian, and 20% waiting to see what happens. And I think that is for a lot of simple people living in villages and so on and so forth, people who do not have oligarchs, millions behind them, they're waiting to see what happens, which is also not a very healthy situation.
And of course, the idea of whether or not this is part of a bigger game between a Russian president who has been at the helm since 2000, and a new U.S. president who is a familiar face. There was that Tuesday phone call between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden, the White House stating that President Biden, quote, emphasized the United States' unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. A lot to say about that phone call, Brian Taylor. First of all, the fact that it happened, the fact that it's been followed up by the invitation sent to the U.S. ambassador to Russia to attend a meeting at the Kremlin this Wednesday, the fact that Biden is talking about a summit at a neutral venue, and again, the fact that they didn't bring up Alexei Navalny at any point.
Yes, I think this was a good step by President Biden to reach out to President Putin at this point and try and once again signal that the U.S. is committed, as you just said, to Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty, but also to try and maybe unwind things a bit and try and get some kind of dialogue going between Moscow and Washington. President Biden, I think, understands that relations between Moscow and Washington are going to continue to be difficult, and I think President Putin understands that as well. But I think they both also believe there is some benefit in talking about certain issues. The ones that Joe Biden mentioned include arms control, they include climate change, include Afghanistan, Iran. So there's plenty to talk about. And the last time there was a Russian-American summit was 2018 in Helsinki with President Trump. And as people will recall, that one was pretty disastrous from the American side, given how President Trump disavowed the findings of his own intelligence community. So I think a summit with Joe Biden will be very different. I don't think they'll expect to get much out of it in terms of deliverables, but it'll be worth them having a chance to communicate directly with each other if the summit takes place.
Are you surprised?
Moscow has not yet
Are you surprised that the phone call happened in view of the fact that it's just a few weeks after Biden had that interview with ABC News where he said that Putin's a killer, prompting the Russian president to recall his ambassador?
No, I wasn't that surprised that the White House decided it was a good time to reach out. I'll remind viewers that Washington has been on the phone a lot this last week with Kiev, with Berlin, with Paris, talking to our allies, talking to other parties. Many people in the Biden administration have also been talking to their counterparts in Moscow, including the chief of the general staff and the chair of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I think that's part of what we'll see with Biden administration diplomacy, believing it's important to keep all of these channels open. And the people who advise Joe Biden, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, they're all committed Atlanticists and believe that it's important to strengthen NATO after the weakening it suffered, quite frankly, when Donald Trump was president.
There's the chair of the Russian Parliament's upper house's Foreign Affairs Committee, Mark Sloboda, quoted as saying, Russia is now getting the respect it deserves. It was a very important step forward, news on a global scale. With this phone call, you agree with those words? And is there the feeling, as it's been portrayed in some outlets, that it was Biden who blinked first?
No, not at all. That's entirely really a U.S. presentation. This idea that Biden blinked for, beating the drums of neo-McCarthyism and Russophobia in Washington, trying to portray Biden as soft on Russia, just like they tried to portray Trump that way. You'll notice that Moscow actually hasn't responded yet. What they have responded is that if the U.S. Resorts to another round of sanctions, and there have been some 80 packages of sanctions over the last several years against Russia, that Russia will take decisive action, and particularly when the U.S. is at the same time trying to make a gesture of improving relations with Russia, meaning we need Russia's help with some things in the world, so we'll continue to slap them with one hand while we, pretend, to be reaching out our hand on the other hand to them. And there's no appetite for this in the country, and I think there's very little appetite.
So how should Vladimir Putin handle Joe Biden?
I think for right now, the best that the U.S. and Russia can do for the next several years to avoid a further deterioration in relations is to continue the political and economic decoupling of Russia from the U.S. and the West, and to go our separate ways, as it were. I don't believe there can be any real improvement of relations with, the continued U.S. military occupation of East Syria, with the continued military.
So wait, you're saying go back to the Cold War era when the two sides didn't have much contact, not much trade?
There was more rules of the road, and there was more respect for both sides during the Cold War than there is right now, and there has been for the last several years. We're already in a new arms race. The U.S. has pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty. All that architecture is in tatters. To his credit, Biden did renew the last foundation pillar, the New START Treaty. So the new arms race is qualitative, not quantitative, thank God, at this point. But I think there's very little constructive we can do for the next several years. Maybe we'll see a change of administration in the United States. Maybe we'll see a change of administration in Russia. But right now, until we see movement in these hotspots, in Syria with the U.S. withdrawing from the country, in Ukraine with the U.S.-backed Kiev regime finally, sitting down, talking with the political representatives in Donbass and fulfilling the UN Security Council solidified Minsk Accords, which they have basically said they are pulling out of.
All right, Julian Nundy, just recalling, would you remember them as the good old days when there was the Cold War, when you were a student?
I think the Cold War were very, very bad old days. But it's true that at the time, diplomatic channels remained open. There was a huge split between Britain and the Soviet Union in 1971, when Britain expelled 105 Soviet diplomats from London. But at the same, I was there as a reporter in Moscow at the time. At the same time, everything where Britain and the Soviet Union were working together in international organizations continued. They were having Middle East peace initiatives, that sort of thing. And they were always, all the diplomatic channels were kept open. It seems to me that the diplomacy is much, much weaker now than it used to be 30 or 40 years ago.
Weaker than it is 30 or 40 years ago. And at the same time, you also have moving pieces, especially within the NATO alliance. We've seen the Ukrainian foreign minister go to Brussels several times in the last couple of weeks. Yes. And we're hearing different noises from different NATO members when it comes to what Ukraine's future relationship will be with the alliance.
Well, I think the majority of NATO countries do not really want Ukraine to join. They see this would be ratcheting up the current situation that would make things worse, not better. And of course, there are those who say that, well, NATO should be right behind Ukraine, supporting it, helping it, and so on and so forth in all ways. If Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, then it would mean that an aggression against Ukraine would be considered an aggression against the whole alliance. And that is something I think that most of the alliance does not want.
And on that score, there
into.
seems to be a difference between, on the one hand, the UK, and on the other, France and Germany?
Yes. France and Germany are very nervous about making such a commitment. And they're right, because it would be a huge step.
Lyudmila Tatieva, your thoughts on that, on how NATO should handle Ukraine?
It's true that it is, let's say, Ukraine now has become a very, let's say, an element that if you take it, responsibility for it, then it will, of course, incur all the actions behind it. But I think the Secretary General of NATO said it very directly. There are a lot of reforms that Ukraine has to do in order to become NATO member, and that covers not only military type of reforms, but that also covers governance and any other points that have been also mentioned by the EU under the EU Association Treaty. And this is something I think that Ukraine should continue to work on in order to become the country that is not an ally or is not a partner that everyone is afraid of.
Do you have the sense in the last week that promises have been made that can't be kept on the part of Ukraine's allies?
I feel like that we have a situation where everyone is taking their time to say whatsoever, and just reassuring the commitment to Ukraine is not enough. That is something that is very obvious, I guess, for everyone. That is something that Ukraine is also saying, that we would require something more than just the words of support of being worried about what's happening at the borders. And the U.S. has been going in this direction in sense of helping Ukraine with some of the, let's say, defensive military pieces that have been provided also by Trump administration and now have been agreed by the Biden administration.
Final question to you, Brian Taylor. In your piece in Foreign Affairs, you focus on the challenges Putin faces domestically. Should Joe Biden have brought up Alexei Navalny in that phone call?
Yes, I think it would have been a good idea to raise that issue, because the situation with Alexei Navalny is very concerning. You know, he's in prison. He's on a hunger strike. He is not being given access to his doctor, which by Russian law he should have access to. So this is something that I know the Biden administration has been communicating to Russia about. It would have been good if that came from President Biden speaking directly to President Putin as well. But it's a tricky sort of tightrope to walk, because Russia is very sensitive about what it perceives as interference in its internal affairs, whereas the U.S. view is that Russia has made democratic commitments, human rights commitments, including in the Council of Europe, and that they should be asked to uphold those commitments. So it's sometimes hard to know what's going to help the democratic and human rights movement in Moscow and in Russia, throughout Russia. But I think asking Russia to abide by its international commitments under various international legal organizations is something that we should return to, we, the West, should return to often, given how often Russia violates those commitments.
All right, much more to talk about on this subject. Unfortunately, we're running short on time. Brian Taylor, I want to thank you for joining us from Syracuse. Mark Sloboda in Moscow. I want to thank as well Lyudmila Tatieva, Julian Nundy. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.